All right, waltzing right back into your lives, back-to-back nights. Talk Buffalo podcast, part of the Blue Wire Network. I am your host, Patrick Moran. Thank you very much, as always, for locking in, whether you're listening on the audio side, whether you're checking this out on YouTube. It's Wednesday. I am joined for the first time, man, in 3 years. I had to look it up. In 3 years since I've had this man on a podcast with me, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. From The Athletic, Matthew Fairburn. What's going on, man? How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. It's been a while. A lot has happened in the world since we last spoke. I mean,
You,
the Bills are the Super Bowl favorites. I'm a married man. I'm a
yeah,
father. There's been a pandemic. I mean, I've moved out of state back into state. So yeah, plenty to catch up on here.
I was looking it up. So this is episode actually 492. I had you on episode 17 when I first had you on. So I had you on really early, and then you were on again like about in June of 2019. And to your point, so much has changed, and you've been back for a while now. So it's not like you're freshly back on the Buffalo in the sports media scene anyway, working in Buffalo again. I know it's been a process moving physically back to Buffalo over the course of the summer and into the fall. But let's start here. So now you're covering the Sabres for The Athletic after covering the Buffalo Bills, of course. Talk a little bit, and I'm sure you've done this before, but maybe in some detail here. Talk a little bit about the decision to come back to Buffalo, maybe take us inside a little bit of that process. Was it a difficult decision? Because again, you covered the Bills in Buffalo. You went to New England to cover the Patriots, where you grew up. From what I remember, correct? Like that's from where you grew up. So you kind of went back home in a way to work. And then ultimately now you're back here again and now you're covering the Buffalo Sabres. Just talk about that decision. Was it a difficult one, the process?
Yeah, the whole last 12 months or so, I think it was about around this time a year ago that we moved to New England.
Mm-hmm.
So I took that job like right before the start of the football season last year. It happened really quick. And I suppose that's the spot to start because, leaving Buffalo was probably the more, was as difficult, if not more difficult than the decision to come back. It was one of those jobs that, like you said, I grew up 30 minutes north of Boston. That media market was always something I had as a goal. It wasn't something I was actively pursuing. An opportunity came up at the Athletic. They were excited about the idea of me jumping on it. And, my wife had always, loved the area and wanted to give it a shot. So we did. And for a variety of reasons, it wasn't exactly what we were hoping. My wife is from Buffalo, so
Mm-hmm.
she was missing family and friends quite a bit. Boston is I mean, I love Boston. I love the area. I wouldn't trade any of that time there because we got so much time with family and friends, that we otherwise wouldn't have gotten. But it's a bigger place, a lot more traffic. There's a lot more, just a lot of different reasons that we thought, eventually long term, whenever we, are done moving, Buffalo probably makes a little bit more sense for us. And John Vogel, it was around the time I think that Tim Graham was out covering Bills Patriots around Christmas that he mentioned John Vogel was thinking it might be his last season. And so
Right.
I just kind of, you know, kept in touch with I obviously kept in touch with Tim and John and Joe and everybody here. And once I realized John was for sure thinking he would transition away from that role, and he and I had a conversation and he said he wasn't really sure. They weren't really coming up with any good internal candidates and they were kind of, wondering what they would do. Buffalo isn't New York or Los Angeles or, one of those places that people are necessarily jumping to move, especially with the Sabres being one of the worst teams in the league. So um, I, brought up the conversation to the bosses, went through the application process, the whole thing. And it was just a great fit because I mean the hockey people at our company are amazing. I feel like that's where the Athletic kind of cut its teeth as a company. And, um, to be able to jump in and fill a spot that John had for 20 years, a spot that Tim Graham had, a spot that
Yeah.
Bucky Gleason had. I mean, I grew up playing hockey, always had been curious about covering hockey. I'd chipped in for John a few times, did a few stories here and there. So the ability to get my family back where they're comfortable and to, have a new challenge coming here was really exciting. And it's been a lot of fun so far. I've really liked getting to know a new team and getting to know everybody down there. And it's kind of a fun time to be jumping onto the beat. It's not quite as depressing a team as it was for the last, 3 or 4 years, I guess.
When did you first start covering the Bills? Because I was going to hit on that. Like, you're kind of jumping on board the Sabres at a time where it feels like, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, their stock is a little bit on the rise. Now, you covered the Buffalo Bills for quite a while. Before The Athletic, you were also at NewYorkUp.com. When did you first start covering the Bills?
2014. So
All right, so they still stunk then.
Yeah, it was Doug Marone's second year. And then, had to cover the Rex Ryan era, as decorated as that was. And and then, so it took a turn probably when around the time, the Athletic launched, right around, 2017 was pretty good. And we launched in 2018. So it was crazy to think that I had, when I introduce myself to people in the hockey world and I say, I covered the NFL for 8 years before this. It's like time flies. I feel old all of a sudden.
Now, people who up to this point have only known you from your professional work and maybe not as much personally, you kind of hit on this before. And I remember when I had you on the podcast, because we really didn't talk much Buffalo Bills. I mean, again, we're going back well over 3 years now, closer to 4 years, but I remember you talking about playing hockey growing up. You've always been, not even whether you're just playing, but a big hockey fan. Like, you're kind of passionate about hockey. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's always kind of been, football and hockey were always kind of the two sports in our house growing up. A little bit of baseball. I played baseball as well, but hockey was probably, as far, especially as playing, was like the sport for me. And when I graduated high school, I stopped playing. Went to University of Missouri, and they don't really have a hockey team. They have a club team that's like 30 minutes off campus.
Mm-hmm.
Hockey's not as big a deal there, but I mean, I remember going to Bruins games with my dad from a very young age, and just even in college, immediately became friends with one of what I have to imagine was one of the few Canadian-born students at the University of Missouri, big Leafs fan, and he and I would, be holed up in the dorm on a Saturday night watching hockey. My roommate was a big hockey fan, so sort of gravitated to those people, and always kind of, kept, tabs on the game, and I loved that I ended up in a market where hockey was, a big deal. And unfortunately, I got here and it was 2014, so they were in the process of losing on purpose and
Literally,
trying to get Jack Eichel. And then the Jack Eichel thing was interesting, but not necessarily the most fruitful for the Sabres. But yeah, I grew up playing goalie in the Boston area. Certainly wasn't good enough to be anything beyond a decent high school player, but just something about the game was always pretty special. And remember collecting the cards and playing the video games and all that stuff. It was always probably the biggest sport in our house, and to this day might still be.
Now, coming back from, or going from Buffalo to New England and then coming back now again to Buffalo, you kind of hit on that not being a terribly difficult decision for a lot of reasons, but switching sports, going from, spending the last 8 years covering the NFL, now you're covering the NHL. So going from football to hockey, was that a pretty easy decision? Was that a little difficult? Like, kind of take us inside that a little bit.
Yeah, it was a little bit difficult. I mean, the beat I had, the Patriots beat is one of the bigger beats at, our company, at any, company really. I mean, the NFL is, sort of the big beat, and the Patriots are one of the most popular teams in the NFL. They're one of the most read teams, even being a lousy team for the most part, the last couple of years, they still are one of those teams that everybody's paying attention to.
Sure.
So there was some of that, but I think what, moving away made me realize is you kind of go, you're going to the big market, kind of that dream job, the big team, the big beat, and it's still, you know, not that much different. There's more people there covering the team. There's more eyeballs probably on your average story. And, you can feel how big of a market it is, but still day to day, you're going to practice. You're seeing who's out there, who's injured. You're making the same calls for the same types of stories. And that's where I kind of realized, when the hockey opportunity came up, it was like, well, it makes a ton of sense on the personal side. And, we're so comfortable in Buffalo and there's so many people that we missed here. Sure, would some people say that going to hockey, hockey's certainly not as popular a sport as, football, and the NHL isn't as popular a league as the NFL. But as soon as I talked with, James Myrtle and, some of the hockey editors about this job and about the vertical and what they do, it was pretty easy for me to be comfortable, jumping. I mean, the Sabres are, one of our top teams as far as engagement, and they haven't even been very good. I think there was part of that too for me, is that the Athletics started and I was part of helping get it established in Buffalo, and there's a lot of readers that I brought in, and it feels good to be going back to those readers and to be working for them again. And yeah, it's a different beat, it's a different sport, and it's taken some getting used to. Don't get me wrong, it's you don't realize how much random football information is downloaded onto your brain, random faces of agents and executives and people
Sure.
around the league. That the combine was in Buffalo for hockey, and I was there, and I was like, I don't know hardly anybody, and it's hard to recognize people. You're trying to get rid of all the football faces out of your brain and download some hockey faces to make some connections and stuff like that. So that part's been interesting. All the roster rules, all the different mechanisms of the NHL, that when you're just watching casually with a beer on a Tuesday night, you're not necessarily and I'm engulfed in all that stuff for football. I'm not necessarily trying to do that in my spare time for hockey. So I have to get up to speed on that. But I feel like I'm getting there, and certainly this team has been fun to get to know over the last few months, and I'm glad I made the move.
When you cover a team professionally, I'm sure a lot of people listen who might want younger people, maybe they want to get into the business someday, or they're just curious and they want to know whether it's football, whether it's hockey, whatever market you go to when it's new. Buffalo's not a new market to you, but this team, this beat is a new team to you. Like you getting to know media relations people or public relations people, inside a department. Practice is the same because, like you said, you cover it. I mean, the Bills only play once a week, but you're at practice every day. I mean, now you're covering Sabres practices, but obviously there's 82 games throughout the course of a season and not 17. I'm sure that's a big adjustment, or getting to know the coaches for the first time and some of the staff or and the players, colleagues, stuff like that. That's a pretty big adjustment, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. It was lucky for me. I had that adjustment certainly in the fall. It was like two different adjustments, because going to the Patriots, all of that you talk about, getting used to new people who don't really know me. I knew some people from internships and crossing paths, covering the same division, uh, but getting to know new PR people, and every beat is a little bit different in terms of the mechanisms of how you get information, right? It might work one way in Buffalo and work a different way in New England. Certainly, New England is a unique beast in that way. Coming back, when I was in New England, the benefit was the sport was familiar, agents, players, how to cover a team was all very familiar, and it was just the nuances of the beat that were tricky. Coming back, it was almost the opposite. It was like all the people, I know pretty much everybody who covers the Sabres or cross paths at some point.
Sure.
And PR wise, Nicole, who runs PR for the Sabres, worked for the Bills for 5 years while I was covering them. So that was great. That's been great to have a familiar face there. But then it's figuring everything else out. Okay, how do I cover a hockey practice compared to how you cover a football practice? It's a little bit different. Or like I mentioned, the rosters and prospects is a completely different thing than football, right? Trying
Sure.
to know all the rules of when can this guy play in the AHL? When is this guy going to get sent back? And you know it's that is all a completely different animal. And the salary cap is similar but different. There's a lot of analytics are completely different. I know I would know where to look for what stats and what stuff would tell me what story in football. And, I'm in the process of figuring that out for hockey. So luckily it's not like I'm jumping into an unfamiliar market where I feel like I know the readers pretty well. I know, the people on the beat. I know enough people within the organization, same owners too, right? Same, there's a lot of employees that, kind of are at both places sometimes. So that part's all been good. Don't have to get familiar with the area again.
Sure.
It's a
That's
comfortable
big
place
too.
to, so all of that stuff helps so that the rest of it covering a new sport is really the challenge. But you do it every day and it really starts to sink in pretty quickly. And it's a matter of, when, certainly I've had, I guess, a tiny little bit of Bills coverage, a little bit with the podcast and stuff like that. But, when it's all hockey all the time, that stuff starts to come pretty quickly. And, I know the sport and grew up loving it. So it's just a matter of refamiliarizing myself with the league and who's good and which players are good and stuff like that. So that's been a process, but the season's starting and hockey's on the TV all the time in the house to keep getting myself up to speed.
Well, I think the people who are both Bills and Sabres fans, which, sorry, Kim Bagula, but they're not all opposite. Some of them actually like both teams, myself included. I think it's a good thing. A lot of people know your work from the Bills, who again are also Sabres fans. So they're instantly comfortable with you covering the team, knowing that you're bringing credibility. And also to your credit, I think you were pretty well liked when you were here in Buffalo, just like Marcel was with ESPN. I mean, you guys left, you go to cover the Patriots. Marcel's now covering the Dolphins, and like fans really didn't shit on you much. You know what I mean? I mean, there's some hardcore Bills fans who, all of a sudden you go to the Patriots, you're the enemy, or like I said, Marcelo in Miami. But for the most part, fans liked you, and I could tell it because they really didn't shit on you a
Yeah,
lot.
it was more so it was weird because I went to New England and a lot of people in New England weren't happy because I was coming from Buffalo, even though I grew up there.
Right.
Um, that was probably another adjustment is like, readership is different everywhere. Fans are fans and you're going to have, tough fans, but in New England they're a little bit of a different 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 group there. They're tough. And they don't mind, telling you about it. So coming back, so I think I had a little bit of both, whereas like there were some Bills fans I think that were not pleased that that's where I was going, but they were definitely a small group. It was more
Right.
so when I was covering the Patriots and when the Patriots and Bills played against each other, what I had to say was not popular on either side. It seemed like I was pissing somebody off one way or the other.
Right.
When
Can't
when
win.
the Patriots won that, wind game, people weren't happy. And then when on the other side, when the Bills won and I, let it be known why and that Josh Allen had kind of dominated them, people weren't happy with that on the other side. So that was interesting, and I was curious how it would be coming back. It's like, have I burned the bridge here with the readers at all? But a lot of people, it was a very warm welcome, and it was um, really helped validate the decision for me because that was a big thing that I missed was the connection to the readers that was hard to kind of establish there in a short time in New England, and it's one of the things that I'm really glad to have back.
Plus, it's not like you like disappeared to Bosnia or anything like that. I mean, from time to time, you've done Tim Graham's podcast, so I've seen you on there, and I'm talking about before you came back. Now, obviously, you'll be on much more with Tim, but you did his show a couple times. I remember watching you on there a few times, which by the way, I really like that podcast a lot. My favorite podcasts are podcasts like Tim's show or Tyler Dunn's because they're not taped in a recording studio. And I think a good podcast should be a conversation. You know what I'm saying? The audio doesn't have to be the absolutely pristine. Everything doesn't have to be scripted and formatted. Sometimes you guys just start riffing. You know what I mean? And that'll take up most of the entire show. So it's not like you completely disappeared. You were still showing your face around it from time to time.
Yeah, I like, going on with Tim, and I was jumping on with Ty now and again because I mean the
Mhm.
Patriots were sort of a story, and so I did the podcast with Joe a few times when the Bills and Patriots were playing one
Right.
another, and tried to. I hope most people understood that leaving was difficult, and certainly me coming back should show people just how difficult leaving was
Sure.
because you know moved moved across, well, not across the country, but moved across state lines twice within 12 months with a baby. So it was not decisions we took lightly, but we're glad to be back and don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon.
No, you were covered even if it's just for a year. You were covering the Patriots, and obviously this is during Josh Allen's ongoing ascension. I'm curious to know, like, what was the view there with fans and maybe the media too in New England? What did they think of Josh Allen? Because like in Buffalo, it became a lot of jealousy towards Tom Brady because of course they always would beat the Bills. He won all the Super Bowls. He's one of the best players, probably the greatest quarterback ever. Like, what other fans think about Josh Allen? At least the beat that you covered, from what you could gather.
Yeah, it seemed like they were slow to be convinced that he was what he is now. And I think there's probably some Bills fans who were the same way in 2020 when it started to turn. And then
Sure,
last year there was, some ups and downs with Josh Allen, but I think by the end of the year it was very clear to everybody in New England that the Patriots had a problem because that guy's now in their division. They were starting to feel very familiar with the problem that Bills and Jets and Dolphins fans had for so many years before them with staring at Tom Brady in the division. And I have to think it's only gotten worse because the way Josh Allen has started the year has been unbelievable. The way he finished the year, really, starting with that Patriots game in December, was unbelievable. Before that, there were moments where he still looked human.
sure.
It was like if you get the right matchup and you scheme him right and you do certain things, you can knock him off his game. I don't know. He hasn't been knocked off his game very much lately. So I think it definitely became a thing, especially there was, and that's what's interesting about that market is how do you covering Bill Belichick. If it were any other coach last year, he probably gets crushed a little bit more. Although in Boston, he still got, people were putting the screws to him for the way that they finished the year. And then the whole offseason of not picking an offensive coordinator and the Bills continuing to get better. It just feels like in other places, it would be like, if it weren't Bill Belichick, he's earned it. But if it
Right.
weren't Bill Belichick, he'd probably be getting, even more criticism. But people in Boston aren't really shy about criticizing him. So I would say Josh Allen, if anything, has just put more pressure on Bill Belichick and the Patriots. Not that he necessarily feels it, but I think it's up the sense of urgency a little bit. It'd be one thing if it was just a middling division, if the Patriots took a step down and it turned into the NFC East or something, but that has not been the case. It has changed hands, and it looked like the Patriots might be able to hold them off last year at one point, but then Josh Allen found this extra gear and just hasn't let up.
One last question, and then we'll talk a couple minutes of Buffalo Sabres. So you've been on the Buffalo Beat podcast with Joe here and there with the season, now with the Sabres season, but that's before the Sabre season started. Now that that's going to kick into gear, are you going to still try to do some episodes with Joe, or with the Sabre season started, is that going to be close to impossible?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to do a ton. So I'm going to try to when I can, but it will be. I was on there quite a bit before the season,
Right.
but it'll be going through this. I finally sat down, went through the schedule, and tried to match it up. And the hockey schedule is a bit of a beast. It's one of the probably the other thing I have to get used to is working all those nights, and they're on the ice almost every day. And I won't be traveling to every single game, but sprinkling in some travel, so it'll be tough to be on the show all the time, but hopefully there'll be a few spots where it might make sense, or but otherwise, it'll probably be a little less frequent than people have grown accustomed to here in the last couple months.
All right, I'm back with Matthew Fairburn from The Athletic. All right, let's turn our attention for a few minutes here to the team that you are now covering, the Buffalo Sabres. This is dropping Wednesday morning, so the regular season starts tomorrow night. I wanted to go through the line pairings a little bit and get your thoughts, because one thing I found interesting was we knew based on what we saw last year, it's no surprise that Tage Thompson and Jeff Skinner would play together, but it was uncertain who would be playing with them, at least to start the season. Again, lines are always fluid and they could change quickly, but over the course of the last handful of practices in preseason, it certainly looks like Olofsson is going to be playing with him. How do you think he's a fit on that line? What do you think of this current, anyway, Sabres top pairing from what you've seen and heard?
Yeah, a lot of firepower, obviously, and I think it'll be interesting to see how Victor Olofsson looks fully healthy. The guy is a shooter, right? He has an incredible shot, and was dealing with an injury that impacted his shot last season, so he wasn't himself. But when you have him and Tage Thompson, the way they shoot the puck, and Jeff Skinner as a goal scorer himself, but also a bit of a playmaker, and I think they view him that way, and so they're going to create a ton of chances, I think. And I don't envision much of a step back, if at all, from Tage Thompson. I think if anything, there's a little bit more, he could bring. And so I think that's an interesting top group to start. If they need to, they can put Alex Tuck up there. But I think the hope is that Tage Thompson is the type of guy who can lift his line the way that Alex Tuck can. And by putting Alex Tuck with Middlestat and Jack Quinn, now you have a guy who's known for making people better with two guys that are going to need it, a rookie and Casey Middlestat, who's had some ups and downs early in his career. So I think the top group is a good group to start with and to see where it goes, because if that can work, then that affords you the luxury of using Alex Tuck elsewhere.
Now, Quinn is going to start the season in Buffalo, as is JJ Paterka. I don't think Quinn's much of a surprise at all. I would say maybe Paterka's at least a mild surprise. I want to get your thoughts on that, in part because Paterka's starting the season in Buffalo, at least again early on, and things could change after a game or two, but this is going to put Vinny Hinostroza in the press box. He's going to be sitting not far from you watching the game on Thursday night. Is that a little bit surprising to you that Hinostroza didn't crack the top 12 and that they're going with Paterka up here in Buffalo to start the season?
Going into training camp, it seemed like maybe JJ Paterka would have to really go and earn that spot. And this is, one of those interesting differences between like football and hockey training camp, is that, and I give the Sabres a lot of credit for this, Kevin Adams and Don Granato mentioned more and more throughout camp the body of work, and that these guys had earned the opportunity by what they did in the AHL last year. Football training camp can be such an event, and every practice is, a huge event, and it all gets blown out of proportion. And there are spots up for grabs and how you perform in those practices and things
Sure.
like that. And that's true of hockey around the league. But in Buffalo this year, they were really set on the idea of getting these young guys time. And I spoke with JJ Paterka last week at some point, and it became pretty clear, I think, at that point that he was going to make the team. Hearing Don Granato talk about, how he picks up information and he's taking to coaching well, and that made him comfortable with the idea that he can learn and grow at the NHL level. And JJ Paterka was thrilled by how this preseason went, in the sense that he didn't feel afraid to make a mistake, because he didn't feel like one mistake was going to cost him. And I think that's actually an important thing for him to have and carry into the season. You saw how in the AHL last year, it took him a while. And so should it be a surprise that in a couple weeks of training camp and preseason, he wasn't lighting up the score sheet? Probably not. It's going to take a little while. I find that whole line to be really interesting. Like, not only are they putting JJ Paterka in the NHL, but they're putting him on a line with Peyton Krebs and Dylan Cousins. It's a
Very
very young
young.
line, very young group. And I wrote about those guys earlier this week. They're almost giving Dylan Cousins this responsibility of being the veteran guy that can carry the line defensively. But, Paterka today, when he was talking to us, he was just, the kid is over the moon to have made the team. And, the energy that he brings, everybody in the room that I've talked to, loves watching him play, loves playing with him. And so I think those qualities really helped him. It's not like he looked out of place in the preseason. He just wasn't probably as productive as Hinostroza was. But this is also the nature of how they built the roster. They didn't bring in a lot of veterans, hardly any. And they wanted these young guys to have the chance to play in the NHL. And bringing back Hinostroza gives them great lineup flexibility because these guys aren't all going to stay healthy for all 82 games. So you have a
Right.
guy that can fill in anywhere from the top line where Olofsson is all the way down to the fourth line with Okposo. We've seen both of those scenarios in the preseason. So he's a good 13th forward to have. And I think it's helpful for Paterka's development to know that he's got, some runway here. It's not a matter of one mistake is going to land him back in Rochester. He has room to grow and figure things out and learn on the fly. And I think that's a great situation for him. And by midseason, it may look like a really smart decision to let him do that.
That line of Cousins, Paterka, and Krebs on paper certainly looks exciting. It has an exciting feel to it. Are you a little bit surprised that they're giving Dylan Cousins this much confidence? They're showing this much confidence, having this much faith in him because, like you said, this is a very young line. You look at Krebs and you look at Paterka, and I'm almost thinking in my mind, man, I wish I had like a Michael Pekka type, an established veteran to center a guy like this. Cousins is still young himself, but I mean, he certainly looks the part.
Yeah, he's old in terms of NHL experience compared to the other two. He's really not that much older than either one of them, but he's played
Right.
more games. One of the things I've noticed since I got here is the way Don Granato and Kevin Adams talk about Dylan Cousins. Every time they're just not afraid to show how much they love this guy and what he brings to the table. Development camp was one of the first events, I guess, that I covered after the draft. And Cousins was down with the young guys, showing them the way. And the way Granato talked about that, it was like, this guy's one of their future leaders. He's already leading the young players. And I do think they feel like a breakout season is coming from him. And I think they trust him in the defensive zone and trust him in the transition game. Peyton Krebs is a good defensive player as well. From what I've been watching, the way he passes the puck and gets it out of the zone, he has really strong defensive instincts. They put him on the penalty kill a few times in the preseason. Cousins is just getting bigger and stronger and is built to eventually be the type of guy they're asking him to be. And that's essentially what you're seeing with a lot of guys is they're going to give them the role that they eventually see them in because they're going to let these guys grow into what they can become. And there might
Right.
be some bumps that come along with that, but they are backing up everything they've said about Dylan Cousins. They're backing it up with their actions by putting him on that line and giving him a chance. It could be a super exciting offensive group. Like, there's a lot of speed, a lot of goal scoring potential. Could the big question I had, and it was asking around last week about it, was the defensive side is, how are these guys going to adjust to that? But Dylan Cousins said if we're in the offensive zone, we don't have to worry about that, and
Yeah.
which is great. And Don Granato said it's actually he's not worried about their assignment, the knowledge of the assignments in the defensive zone. He said they just have to get the instincts right of when a play is dead and you can transition to offense. Figuring that out is a little bit different at the NHL level, but how do you do it if not by getting out there and doing it? So is it a little bit of a risky trio that they put together? Could you put Asplund with them and felt a little bit more balanced and a little bit better about how they would play defense, sure. But man, there's a lot of upside with that group. And if you see them potentially together long term, it probably doesn't hurt to get them started right away.
Yeah, for sure. On the blue line, so you got Yoki Haru is going to be playing with Owen Power. What do you think of that fit? I mean, Darlene playing with Samuelson, that was a given. I mean, it's not like for now anyway. It's not like there's a lot of other options, so it's kind of like you guys are going to have to learn to play together. Do you feel like that could be a good fit for Owen Power though?
It'll be interesting because Yoki Haru can make some risky plays with the puck sometimes in his own end, and you've got obviously a very young Owen Power who's bound to make a few mistakes of his own, but they both are pretty strong, with the puck, and Yoki Haru is still pretty young as far as a defenseman goes. He's still, I think, figuring things out and getting better, still improving. So I am fascinated. Probably the most interesting player I think to follow this season is going to be Owen Power, just because you think about the trajectory of the organization if he's really good. Obviously Rasmus Dahlin has to continue to build off what he did last year, but if you can have two legit franchise defensemen, that really sets you up long term to build. And so Yoki Haru, will it be a bit of a dicey pairing at times? I'm sure it will. I'm sure it won't go perfectly smooth, but Power has been really, really solid and does not look like he's as young as he is out there. I mean, his size alone, but his composure and his calmness with the puck when it's on his stick, he's very comfortable pinching in and keeping plays alive in the offensive zone. And it goes back to talking about Don Granato just trusting players and letting them figure it out. He's, a guy like Owen Power went number 1 overall. He's going to be one of those people who's exceptional at figuring things out at whatever level, when he has to figure it out. And so that's been Don Granato's approach. Put him out there. He's on the power play. Put him out there. See where maybe he needs some coaching, if he does at all, and jump in then. But don't overcoach him to the point where you're taking out some of the stuff that makes him special. And part of that is his instincts and the way he plays the game. So, I mean, he's got a legitimate chance to win the Calder, I think. And, as a defenseman, I think he's going to put up quite a few points, especially if he sticks on the power play all year.
It's fun, whether it's fans together at a water cooler or a podcast or sometimes mainstream media talking about the forwards and the pairings and the defensemen and the pairings. But goaltending doesn't get talked about nearly enough, I don't think, anyway. And you look back to, say, last year's Sabres team, Anderson got hurt and the goaltending was largely a mess because of large part injuries. For now, this is a unit that's healthy and they brought in Eric Comrie. Now, look, if Anderson would have been healthy all of last year, they still weren't going to make the playoffs. But they would have, I think they would have won more games for sure, been a little more competitive in the standings. Eric Comrie, so he goes into the season now, number 1 with Anderson there as well. UPL is going to start the season in Rochester. If you're a fan, what do you think your confidence level in Eric Comrie being able to handle this type of role should be?
I think it should be reasonably high, but I wouldn't go crazy with expectations just because he hasn't done it, right? I mean, until he does have that type of workload, it's hard to know how that's going to translate in that sample size. There's a lot that's different about handling that type of workload in the NHL. I wouldn't panic over his preseason. He let in a ton of goals in the games that he played, but apparently he was the one who asked to play in those games where they would be on the road, they would be facing tougher lineups, and the Sabres